Recording. Wait, quick question. I'm recording to this computer as opposed to the cloud. Is there a difference?
Yeah, it's on your computer and not the cloud.
Right, but is there one that is preferable?
Nah, it's cool. It's
Okay,
just gonna be a file on your computer.
cloud is easy to share. Damn. All right, should I do cloud? You can upload it somewhere if it's on your PC. Man, I'm getting mixed messages. Cloud is not secure. Okay, we're sticking with this. All
Yeah,
right.
just put it on your machine and you'll be good to go.
So we're going to kick it off. Well, thank you all for joining us, first of all, and sharing your Saturday afternoon or what time, day it may be, wherever you are with us. You know, Erica, Roshan, and I put this together, and we hope that it will cover a lot of what degrowth is in basic terms, and hope that we all leave with, we have a fun activity plan for the end that I think will be good to take back with us in our organizing. We're gonna start with some community agreements before we get started on the presentation. If you want to rename yourself, you can, or introduce yourself in the chat with your pronouns. These are just some community agreements that we've used. I think there's literally a protest happening outside my house, but I'll talk louder. These are some community agreements that a lot of people use in facilitation spaces. If you have some of your favorites that you don't see on here, feel free to drop it in the chat and I'll read it aloud. But community agreements are not necessarily like values, but rather just concrete steps that we can take to communicate better during this discussion. So wait is, why am I talking? Just being able to answer that before you speak, I think is helpful for any time. Using I statements instead of, starting a sentence with like, you did something, or, something you center yourself and your feelings. Progressive stack, this will come handy when we start discussions. You just type in stack and that's the order in which people will talk. Listen when others are talking, don't wait to talk, because that means you are, like internally thinking about what you're going to say as opposed to actually actively listening to the person that's talking. Please assume best intentions. All of us, our thoughts, our histories, our opinions are products of our own histories, and our histories are different. And that's what makes us smarter and stronger. So just assume the best intentions of each other and ask clarifying questions if you are like, what did they just say? No acronyms, or if you are going to use them, just explain what it is first. And then throughout the presentation, before we start our actual discussion and question and answer, if you have questions about what is on the slide or what is being said, drop them in the chat, because then we won't have to pause recording for us to hear your question, and we can, hopefully address it as we look at it. Next is our agenda for how we're going to spend the next hour. We're going to go over growth and the climate crisis, just the inception of where we are today. And then we're going to debunk some of the popular solutions put forth by liberals for climate change. And then we're going to really delve into degrowth and then have Q&A. Oh, I'm Jamie. I use she, her pronouns.
Roshan? And I'm Roshan. I use he, him pronouns.
I'm Erica. She, her pronouns.
All right, so let's jump into it. I don't think I need to tell any of you this, but we are in the middle of a climate crisis. The last 5 years are our hottest on record. We're facing unprecedented biodiversity collapse. We have 1 million species that are threatened with extinction. We have entire ecosystems that are disintegrating and disappearing. It is a global catastrophe, and obviously the effects of this catastrophe are not uniform. You can see from this map that the impacts of climate change are largely going to be felt by what we know as the global south. And this is because of a historical pattern of settler colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism perpetrated by European and American interests, primarily. So I'm gonna hand it over to Erica to explain kind of how we got here.
Right, so how the fuck did we get here, right? I would say the concept of economic growth is relatively new, right? Like it didn't just come out of thin air. So I would say around the 1800s, right when the Industrial Revolution was getting started, that's when the concept of growth really came through and was conceptualized by a lot of people. And this idea of growth was also conflated with this like idea of progress as well, like in the Western sense of like all progress is linear, like GDP growth is linear. So I'll talk about what GDP growth is later on. But first, I want to talk about how advancements in technology and science during this period really helped capitalists exploit resources. And in doing so, this kind of puts us on the timeline of complete and utter ecological collapse. So in terms of like the accumulation of capital, that's what's really important here. Economic growth, accumulation of capital, those two things go hand in hand together with the rise of international development as a form of neocolonialism. It still helped enable colonizers to extract resources from other countries. This idea of surplus value, right? Especially when you're harvesting agriculture, it's not just for subsistence, there's also surplus value. So colonizers took that idea and used it to exploit their natural resources. And that was ultimately a way of spreading global capitalism. When you tell a country that, hey, they should grow a bunch of these so that they could be exported so that the country's economy can grow in terms of GDP, that's like a totally legitimate system, right? And so then that's how the spread of capitalism ultimately began. So here's a map. The countries in blue have higher levels of GDP, whereas the countries in orange have lower levels of GDP. So what is GDP, right? Well, gross domestic product accounts for the total value of all final goods and services newly produced within a country's physical borders throughout the year. The universal acceptance of GDP as a legitimate indicator of development and human well-being has had some really bad consequences on the direction of global development. It basically raised the imperative of countries to adopt policies geared towards raising this artificial number. And in turn, developed countries were able to hide any sense of accountability under this facade of economic progress as they benefited from the extraction of resources from quote unquote developing countries. I also want to add that GDP growth is a terrible indicator for many reasons, but one of them being that countries like the United States and countries in Europe can place factories through multinational corporations, MNCs, in countries in Africa and Asia, and that artificially raises the GDP of a country. So it makes it seem like a country is growing as a whole because its economy is growing, right? But why does it matter if there are foreign factories being placed in this country and the profits go back to the United States and to other countries?
So this slide is to really visualize what we mean when we talk about growth. We're talking about infinite growth in both negative and positive directions. In order to establish and maintain this empire, there had to happen in parallel, first the growth or infinite growth of indigenous genocide and land theft. So that is growing the number of people that are refugees, that are indigenous to their land, but cannot be with their land or on their land, negatively growing the number of land that is being stolen. And then at the same time, in tandem, there is the infinite positive growth, reproduction of free, enslaved, imprisoned labor in order to keep up the economy. Next slide. And as we infinitely grow through both directions, we end up with this world ecological footprint. We see starting with 1960, as Erica was saying, that's especially when countries that were being newly developed and newly independent had to adopt to global standards and really raise resource extraction just to keep up. So you'll see we're already past the threshold of one Earth. I mean, it's insane to even like read the sentence number of Earths demanded because like what, there's only one Earth. But at this rate, next slide, we'll end up, you know, consuming the number of like, or resources needed on 3 planets as opposed to 1. And I want to highlight the fact that we've been able to live sustainably on just one planet for centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution and the birth of growth, ideology, and capitalism and private property. And then the next few slides, I just wanted to compare like resource consumption and the ecological and material footprint of the empire versus some of the other countries. Oh, so the first one was the United States versus a country like Costa Rica. The pattern you'll soon see is just the US surpassing in every sense of the word the planetary boundaries, the biophysical limits, with other countries you know, being below or well below the threshold. Thank you. Okay, so that's Costa
Sorry
Rica.
about that. Back.
The next one is even China. You know, there's a lot. China is cited to be the #1 emitter of carbon emissions right now, but if you look at the cumulative emissions, the United States is still very much on top. I mean, its military alone is one of the top polluters of the earth. And you'll see that, you know, I think, again, what Erica was pointing to, a lot of the CO2 emissions coming from countries like China are for the consumption of the West. It doesn't necessarily come back to the people that are making these things, that are producing these things. And even then the, you know, material and ecological footprint in China is much, much lower. And then the next one is a country like Senegal. I mean, well below the threshold. Oh, you want to read the inner circle? Can you go back? I can drop the links for this too. Oh, I think if you go back to the very first slide, it'll show what those acronyms are. Or that one, yeah. Like life satisfaction, equality. Okay, I don't actually know how to read that part of them. We'll get back to you. I mean, I don't know, do y'all understand it? Okay, cool. Donut economics. Social indicators. Oh my God, hi Adrian. Yes, thank you for the link. That's where we saw it. So this just goes to show, you know, that the third world is not poor. The colonizers didn't go to these poor countries to make money. These countries are rich, only the people are poor, and that's because they're paying for the cost of empire. I think it's important to remember that the language that they use to describe these countries as underdeveloped or developing, it's not that, but rather that they're overexploited by the empire. Next, yeah, that's Parenti.
Great. So what is sustainable development and where does the concept of growth come from? So like I talked about before, it started within the Industrial Revolution period. I want to talk more about how sustainable development kind of emerged as a concept after that, after the idea really took off. So basically the concept of sustainable development, it emerged in the aftermath of growing environmental critiques of development. It legitimizes the damage and destruction that capitalism wreaks. And it suggests an incremental reform over structural change, a maintenance of the status quo over the possibility of a more sustainable world, basically. So the logic of infinite economic growth was ultimately like forced to reconcile with the finite availability of resources on the earth. And this is kind of the solution, quote unquote, of that like neoliberals came up with to make economic growth more palatable and more legitimized. So this sort of environmentalism also reinforces a global system that continuously privileges developed countries over quote unquote developing ones by reproducing the cultural logic of modernity and progress. Environmentalism of this kind doesn't really pose a meaningful threat to existing power relations. So when we think about how international development and colonialism evolved, sustainable development was another way for the colonizers to expand their presence in these countries, thereby legitimizing their presence. So limits to growth. First, the most developed countries contribute the most to global carbon emissions and resource depletion. You guys know this, but according to a study by Oxfam in 2015, around 50% of these emissions can be attributed to the richest 10% of people around the world, who have average carbon footprints that are 11 times as high as the poorest half of the population and 60 times as high as the poorest 10%. And of course, these countries base their metrics of standard of living heavily on GDP growth, and that would entail constantly expanding output and consumption. And for a planet with a finite amount of resources, that linear progress of economic growth isn't really sustainable. This sort of culture, this cult of overconsumption, however, isn't just limited to developed countries. For decades, excess, for example, has been adopted as a symbol of success in countries like Brazil, China, and India. So the 1972 report, Limits to Growth, describes a computer simulation of exponential economic and population growth with a finite supply of resources. The team of MIT researchers concluded that, quote, if the present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. The most probable result will be a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. So as you can see from this graph here, the paper was done in 1972, so if we look at where that is, it maps out the current trends of where all these indicators are on, and then it kind of like maps out to projectiles. It extrapolates it, and not necessarily extrapolates, sorry, but it kind of like predicts where it's going based on the data that's available. And we can see here that food per capita is going to go through a steep decline between 2000 and 2050, along with industrial output per capita, just by nature of so many resources being depleted. And you can see other indicators as like services per capita also going through a very steep decline. So this just goes to show that there are limits that we can conceptualize and visualize through this graph. There are limits to growth that we see.
Great. So now that Erica's kind of introduced us to the ideas of sustainable development and economic growth, I'm going to talk a little bit about how they have come together in this sort of global north agenda of green growth. So in 1987, the United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development released this report called Our Common Future, more commonly known as the Brundtland Report. And so it contained one of the first definitions of sustainable development, and it was sort of this recognition of the burgeoning ecological crises around the globe, but it attempted to square that reality with the desire to have a quote-unquote global development process led by global finance. And the way that you attract global finance as you present them with an opportunity. In this case, that opportunity is growth. The report claims over and over again that sustainable development is a pathway to growth. So, of course, these global financial institutions, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, are engines of neocolonialism. Erica talked about this, about how these institutions, particularly the World Bank, have encouraged the development of so-called developing countries in ways that immiserate their populations while exporting their goods to the global economy for consumption by the global north. So the World Bank in particular is an architect of some of the most brutally extractive neoliberalization schemes of the last half century. And as you can see by this image, they are now on the green growth train as of 2012. So what this means is we can see that the agenda of green growth is to fuel the global north's consumption through extraction of resources from the global south, all under this shiny veneer of sustainable development. So we're going to talk now about this idea of decoupling, and you can trace it back as far as this Brundtland report. It claims that sustainable development through economic growth would eliminate poverty through technology advancements, and these technology advancements would enable production to increase with less and less material energy input. intuitively, I think most people would agree that this is kind of just counterintuitive, right? Like, how is it possible that we can just continue producing and producing and producing without increased material input? And so the Venezuelan sociologist and economist Edgardo Lander called this an extraordinary conceptual juggling act in his report, The Green Economy, The Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. Despite all this, it's a dominant mode of thinking. We just saw recently Andrew McAfee, this guy in the business school at MIT, just wrote an entire book about environmentalism based on the idea of decoupling. And it's entirely dependent on this idea. So the problem is decoupling doesn't really exist. Developed countries have outsourced their dirty industrial activities to less developed ones, so-called less developed ones, and can therefore claim that they've lowered their carbon emissions much more than they actually have. So this graphic is from the Stockholm Environment Institute, and it tracks emissions created within the urban centers of various nations. Now, the colored portions are what are called territorial emissions. So basically, they are the per capita emissions that are generated entirely within these urban centers. So you can see that the US, of course, outpaces everyone, and you have these nations that are normally thought of as very sustainable, like Norway and Sweden, which do have less than half of the territorial emissions than the US. However, these gray bars on top constitute additional consumption, and that means the emissions from processes and sites of extraction that are not located in the urban centers. And this can be domestically and abroad, but I'd encourage you to think about where these sites of extraction tend to be located, whether they are domestic or abroad. It tends to come at the expense of environmental justice communities, Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities. So we can see that a country like Norway, where per capita urban emissions are less than half of the US's, benefits hugely from this outsourced extraction to the extent that overall, when we count that, it's roughly the same as the US. So what we can see from that, and that's despite the widespread proliferation of renewables, public transit, much more so in Norway than in the US. So what we can see from this is that there is no decoupling here, right? They have embraced these renewable technologies, but we exist in a global economy. And so this idea of decoupling, essentially that we can just sort of innovate our way out of environmental impact when we increase production, is just not in line with the reality that we face, where these emissions actually end up being relocated geographically to other places, which are often in the global south. Even with all that, there's a line of thinking even on the left that embraces decoupling, which brings us to eco-modernism. So eco-modernism is a school of thought that emerged from these environmental academics, we'll say, around 2010-ish, and it sort of culminated in this eco-modernist manifesto, which was written in 2015 by a group of people, many of whom are associated with the think tank, the Breakthrough Institute. And it argues that to solve environmental issues, we need to supercharge technological development and use technology as a means of decoupling. So essentially, if we leverage technology, we can achieve a decoupled society that we can, live in this sustainable luxury without any impact on the environment. Now, eco-modernism isn't really inherently anti-capitalist. There are plenty of eco-modernists that are liberals, and even sort of centrists and almost conservative-aligned people. However, certain parts of the primarily white and Western left have adopted it. And so many left proponents of eco-modernism draw from this interpretation, one particular interpretation of Marx and Engels, which argues that seizing the means of production will allow us to increase production and therefore provide abundance for all. These folks tend to characterize degrowth as austerity, collapse porn, ecological austerity, and my personal favorite, eco-Thatcherism. And what it eventually sort of tends to lead to is this argument for fully automated luxury communism, right? Asteroid mining, gene editing, this piece and book by Aaron Bastani just talks about how we can innovate our way out of the climate crisis and provide so much material excess for everyone. But as we just saw, all this material excess relies on raw materials, and those materials have to come from somewhere. So when eco-modernists say they want abundance for all, we need to think about who's included in that all. How can we have luxury for all when that luxury is created through extraction and exploitation? And when we think about luxury, what are we really talking about, right? Do we mean material luxury, or are there alternative ways of conceptualizing luxury and well-being that mean that everyone can have the right to live a good and full life? So with that, we're going to really dig deeper into that idea in a few minutes and talk about the actual definitions and conceptions of degrowth. But for now, we're going to take a couple minutes to stretch and go to the bathroom as necessary. So we will see you in a couple minutes.
2:33. We'll start. Okay, is everyone back? Yeah, sorry, this is fast. But we also don't want to go over an hour, But we really need to degrow the speed of this. All right. I'll try to do the next parts a little slower because it's a bit text heavy and it's about degrowth, so. And we are running like 2-3 minutes behind. We go to the next slide for me, please. All right. So if folks are back, we will get started. So now we will talk about degrowth, the reason that we are all here. I'll just quickly say that the reason that I wanted to create this space for us is, well, one, because there was so many likes on the tweet that I tweeted out about whether there are people of color interested in degrowth. And because I think there's something that we as non-white people and some of us non-Westerners can offer to the degrowth space that doesn't currently really exist, because it's such an academic and Western space, but they do not have ownership over this idea. And in fact, it's something that we have been practicing for a lot longer that they have just coined. So it's ours to take back. Okay, next slide. I wanted to ground us in this idea of common sense before we got started into degrowth, because when we talk about degrowth and when we talk about transforming society, we're really talking about transforming like literally every single aspect of society and civilization and how we even organize society, right? So these are words by Stuart Hall writing on Gramsci that I emphasize by using growth and degrowth. So I'll just read aloud that the ideology of growth is implicit, and it manifests in art, in law, in economic activity, in all manifestations of individual and collective life. And we are on a mission to degrow that version of common sense and replace it with a new common sense, a new humanity, a new language, and to really marginalize this ideology as the core common sense that motivates our society and really motivates the design of every part of society. So if we are to understand common sense as the entire terrain of conceptions and categories in which the practical consciousness of like us is actually formed, and it's already formed and it's taken for granted, then that is the terrain on which we are working to insert degrowth and transform into a degrowth society. So I just wanted to orient us in this because it's a huge project. It's a huge, you know, upending of everything that we've known. But as Erica and Roshan alluded to earlier, you know, it's growth is still a new concept. It's only been around like 300 years, and we can beat it and build something anew. So we're going to approach degrowth from these three angles. First, on material degrowth, and then on economic degrowth, and on cultural degrowth. Because if we are, again, to understand common sense is something that we have to replace and rewrite, then, you know, we're really dealing with all aspects of society, right? And human life and social life and non-human life. And in each of those approaches, we're going to highlight three principal vocabulary terms out of the degrowth language. So for material degrowth, we'll focus on limits and self-limitations. For economic degrowth, we'll focus on this French term, depends. Again, if some of you are French speakers and I don't pronounce it correctly, sorry, I don't care. And the principle that we'll highlight, which I think is the most critical principle of degrowth, is for cultural degrowth, is care. So first is on limits and material degrowth.
All right. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about limits and material degrowth. And so when we think about limits, obviously there is, we've already talked about this, there are global ecological limits that we are up against. So when we talk about material degrowth, Susan Paulson defines it as decreasing the quantity of matter and energy transformed each day by the metabolism of human society. And what that means in more plain language is just producing and consuming less stuff, making less stuff, using less stuff. We use so much stuff, particularly in the global north. However, we want to push back against this idea of degrowth as austerity, right? It's public abundance and a rethinking of how we conceive luxury and wellness. Because although the high-income countries of the world only account for 16% of the world's population, those of us who are here, we account for about 34% or 683 million tons of the world's waste. We produce so much waste. We're overflowing in waste, and in many cases, we're exporting it to the global south. So a relevant example here is e-waste. And you can see these fields of e-waste. In the left is Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and the right is Accra in Ghana. And most recycling, and sorry, e-waste is, of course, waste from electronic products. Most recycling of US e-waste takes place abroad. It's tough to find really definitive numbers on this because these supply chains are so complex, but some estimates indicate that 50 to 70% of e-waste from the US that's intended to be recycled is shipped abroad to developing countries, most often Asia and Africa. It often ends up in informal junkyards where local economies form around them, and many people are exposed to harms of these toxic components. So the reason that I think this is a particularly salient example in terms of material degrowth is that we need renewable energy, right? Everyone knows that we need renewable energy. However, developing renewable energy and these electronic and technological components at an industrial scale to meet our current levels of consumption in the global north will, among other issues, result in a ton of e-waste. And this will exacerbate these problems when we're not recycling them properly and we're just producing too much. So there are a lot of ways that we can think about solving the problem of e-waste and waste more broadly. One of them is about the right to repair and thinking about zero waste. So the right to repair is the idea that when we have technologies we're rejecting this idea of planned obsolescence, right? We're rejecting the idea that when we buy a phone or a car or something like this, that it's only supposed to last a few years and then we get a new one. Rather, we want to be able to actually build things that last and be free to repair them, because a lot of times you can't just repair these things on your own. They're made to not be able to be repaired. They're made to be replaced by something you have to buy again. And that, of course, encourages this incredible cycle of production and waste. So beyond e-waste, we can talk about limiting single-use plastics. Obviously, the sort of liberal conception of straw bans and plastic bag bans, we need to move beyond that and think about targeting production and the ways that we relate to these materials. Why have we set up our societies in ways that use all of these plastics? How can we orient in ways that don't leave people behind, that aren't classist when we talk about plastic bag bans, that aren't ableist when we talk about straw bans? So we have to change our entire conception. And another avenue of this is talking about our agriculture. We produce so much food. We produce enough food today for 10 billion people, yet there's incredible amounts of food waste and there's incredible amounts of hunger across the world. We need to rethink our agricultural systems to materially degrow. And so that brings us to this idea posited by Kali Akuno, who of course is one of the leaders involved with Cooperation Jackson, which is a really incredible sort of eco-socialist, Black-led collectivist project in Jackson, Mississippi. And he posits this idea of regenerative production. Essentially, we're countering extractivist logic, where we simply take from the earth to produce more things, with regenerative logic, where whenever we take something from the earth, we inspect what we're taking and how we can sort of manage it throughout its life to contribute back to the earth and make sure that we're not overwhelming ecosystems and make sure that we're caring for people. And the final idea I want to posit in terms of material degrowth is my personal favorite, which is just working less. We work so much. We make so much stuff because we work so much. There was a relatively recent study, I believe targeted on the UK, that stated that if we just change the working week from 5 days to 4 days and do nothing else, we can reduce emissions by 15%. So when we think about wholesale, just reducing the amount that we work and we produce, that results in more leisure time, more community building, greater well-being, and also less ecological harm.
Okay, so the next characteristic that I wanted to highlight on is depends, which is associated with the idea of economic degrowth. And it really describes the destiny of surplus, how we as a society collectively choose to disperse of surplus energy and value that is created. So on the right side, you'll see private depends, which is how our capitalist society is organized today. All of the wealth is accumulated privately for individuals. It really lends to an incredible amount of resources that are wasted. So for example, a rich person will buy a second home that is privately owned by them and them only. That second home will remain empty for half of the year while the number of unhoused people grows exponentially. And all of that resource, that house, sits there and is wasted simply for the circulation of capital, because capital that which sits idle is no longer capital. It has to be invested and keep creating more capital in order for wealth to be accumulated. So the private and individual depends, is very vital for growth. And to collectively dispense of something is to liberate those resources from the hands of the private few to meet the needs of everybody. Now, the idea of collective depends, again, does not mean that we're going to have less things, but rather that the meeting of our basic necessities, our basic needs, is a prerequisite. It is not something that we have to work for. It is not something that we have to pay for. It is the beginning of how we use our energy collectively as a society. And then whatever is surplus is collectively then decided so that all of us, regardless of our age or our ability, can collectively make sense of and choose to have a good life, and what good life means, and what prosperity means, and what having wealth means. And it also is tied to the idea of the next 7 generations, which is borrowed from indigenous philosophy. It is to disperse of surplus energy so that we are preserving them for the next 7 generations, not just for ours and the people that are here with us, but for those that will continue to come after us. And it's really, an idea of building new institutions that allow us, that enable us to collectively decide how to dedicate the resources that we have available to us.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural degrowth and more specifically how the advertising industry hurts us all. So I would say that a radical departure from the economic structures that have basically destroyed our natural ecosystems requires another evolution of human values that is more conscious of like the finite nature of our planet's ability to provide, just as how, you know, people who believe in capitalism shouldn't believe in capitalism anymore and should adapt their mindset accordingly. This kind of applied to how we think about the environment, because the concept of growth, even like leftists and capitalists like still believe in that. So it's really important that more and more people know about it, by nature of it being, like Jamie goes into, not a very common sense logic. So I think to get into what cultural degrowth means, I think it's important to bring up some critical theorists who have written a lot about the harms that the advertising industry has created. So Herbert Marcuse, in his book One Dimensional Man, Studies in the Ideology of Advanced Industrial Society, examines critically the cultural impacts of industrial capitalism and the way it creates these things called false needs. So in it, he argues that the emergence of consumer-oriented cultures was homogenizing human experience and providing people with little more than a comfortable unfreedom. To go off of that, advertising basically spurred the development of such false needs, raising the demand for private goods and increasing GDP. This in turn diverted resources away from the provision of public goods. So when we think about the investments that are made into research and development, technology, most of them are for private consumption and not necessarily for public goods, healthcare, etc. So Fred Hirsch, former financial editor of The Economist, described the social limits to growth. He argued that obtaining higher end goods, he describes the term positional goods, as goods that signal one's position in society. He argues that such goods do nothing to elevate one's class position, given that growth cannot generalize access to goods, as their essence is that only a few can have them. It can only inflate their prices and intensify frustration. So as George Simmel points out, just as soon as the lower classes begin to copy their style, the upper classes turn away from this style and adopt a new one, which in turn differentiates them from the masses, and thus the game goes merrily on. So this type of process is also known as trickle-down theory. Basically encapsulates the consumer mentality under capitalism, the use of advertising to push people into conceptualizing these false needs, spurs them on to buy more and more so that producers can earn more in profits, which in turn lead them to produce more. So it's basically this cycle that ends up in immense resource depletion. And you can see that happening today. Let's take the fashion industry, for example, fast fashion especially. Trends come and go very easily and very quickly. And so last season clothing for the elite becomes affordable for the non-elite in the next. We can see this with designer clothes being last season being more affordable for non-elite people, quote unquote. So within the degrowth community of scholars and activists, calls for placing bans and taxes on advertising have already been made. A set of 8 policy proposals call for a reduction in advertising by establishing very restrictive criteria for allowing advertising in public spaces. As you can see here, advertising on storefronts was banned, so it looks completely different in the picture on the right. And prioritizing the provision of information and reducing greatly any commercial use is also key here. And you want to be able to make sure that you can reclaim these public spaces, right? It's not just about getting rid of advertising and convincing people that they don't need to consume as much, but it's also about reclaiming these spaces because they're for the community, not these corporations. And what's really important to point out here is that people's rights as consumers shouldn't matter as much as their rights as workers. And that's what capitalism has done. It's told us that we have rights as consumers, but that only leads to exploiting workers and seeing them as less than us, as us, the consumers, basically. So I also want to talk about how private needs are spurred on by capitalism and advertising, right? Like our right to own personal property, private property, that's pushed on heavily, but our rights, our collective rights, bring on food accessibility, food security, healthcare, and those are the type of needs that we need to be focusing on.
So I think it's great that Erica focused on the advertising industry, because it's, again, a reminder that, the idea of growth and competition and everything that, people call human nature is not something that's spontaneously formed in our individual brains. It's something that is advertised to us. It is something that is taught to us. It is something that we learn from the very beginning, and it is something that we have to unlearn. And what is natural to us, however, is care. The infinite growth of the free market economy is something that is extremely unnatural. It is perhaps the only unnatural thing that is, or something in the world that is designed to grow infinitely. And I think there's a lot of writing in literature and poetry that also shows that, war and violence against one another is not also natural to us. What is natural to us and what is prevalent and common in all of history and in all aspects of life, both human and non-human, is care. And these are just some of the different ways that we can define care: caring about someone and something, taking care of someone and something, giving care, and also receiving care. I think the giving and receiving aspect of care also allows us to, address harm or the lack of care or insufficient care, or, and, processes that are not implemented and practiced in our daily life. And this is just a little bit on autonomy and the concept of agency and subsidiarity that are central to degrowth that I wanted us to look at. So that's care. I mean, I think care is extremely self-explanatory, but also something that we are so foreign from. Care to me, in the simplest term, is to protect those that are vulnerable and to be prepared to do so at a personal cost. And I think it's central to degrowth because things like limits and refraining from pursuing all that can be pursued won't happen without care if you don't care about others. Depends to collectively decide how to spend what belongs to all of us is not possible without care. If you don't give a shit about anybody else but yourself or the earth or whatnot, I mean, I think care is very central to everything that we need to do, and therefore very significant. And with that said, so we are at 240 or 254. This, can you go to the next slide, please? This last slide concludes the presentation portion. What we're going to do next is come up with some guiding questions for degrowth. This is modeled after critical resistance and their guiding questions for prison abolition organizing. So I'm just going to quickly read aloud these. It asks, does your work seek to make the prison industrial complex a less workable solution to problems and to limit its reach over our lives? Does your work take on aspects of the prison industrial complex that are most harmful? Do you work to fight forms of harm like white supremacy, heterosexism, and class prejudice, both in your campaigns and within your group? Are you working in coalitions with abolitionist goals? Are you working to help other coalition members understand abolition? Does your work reject the prison industrial complex everywhere? Does your work suggest workable ways to maintain self-determination, meaningful safety, and collective health? Does the language you use challenge commonly accepted notions of safety, responsibility, and justice? does your immediate work make future challenges to the prison industrial complex possible? Now, for something that we can take away together from this training, I thought we would come up with similar framework questions for degrowth, so that when we are doing our individual local organizing back home after this training, we can always return to this and center our mission to advance a degrowth society. So with that said, I'm gonna stop recording. How do I do that? Stop recording.